All right, so we're going to be talking about MPOS, so mobile point of sale terminals today. We're going to keep the introduction and the light, fluffy stuff to a minimum, and we're going to basically get straight into taking a look at them from a security perspective, the vulns we found, and we're going to be demoing some exploits and some fairly sweet stuff. So I'll let Nils introduce himself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nils. I'm a security researcher at MWR. Previous research focused on mobiles, specifically Android. And 2 years ago, we did a lot of research into payment terminals, so the traditional payment terminals that you use for chip and pin payments. And we extended also recently that research onto ATMs as well.
Yeah, so I'm John. I head up the UK independent research for MWR. A lot of my background has been in vuln dev and reverse engineering, and I've worked also with Nils on the payment terminal security and the ATM stuff. Also quite involved in browser security, specifically for Chrome. So you probably all used point-of-sale devices. I mean, they're absolutely everywhere. Anytime you make any chip and pin payment, you've used a point-of-sale device. And we've done some research and some presentations into that before. Obviously, the trend is for everything to go mobile, right? Because, you know, why not? So the hipsters have decided that payments should be mobile too. And so they came up with mobile point-of-sale. It has a few advantages, especially for small businesses, mostly around cost effectiveness. So you don't have to have some crazy back-end setup, and you don't have to necessarily have a payment provider with a contract. You can have like a rolling single transaction fee, for example. Sometimes it is used by larger companies who are trying to be really cool. One example being Apple. So they've been using their own iDevices and a little kind of card slot on the back for a while now. This is probably the most prominent use of MPOS. They haven't really taken off too much just yet in commercial markets, but they're certainly becoming more popular. So let's take a contrived example. Say you have a small business owner who's selling some very bespoke software. So it's high value, and you know, to be honest with you, he's getting quite tired of carrying bags of cash around. It's not the best way to take payments. You know, he can afford some cool shoes though. Got to give it to him. So this could be one example where he could rock up with an MPOS device instead and take card payments instead of carrying around his bags of cash. So if we take, for example, iZettle, who are one of these little devices, for example, he could carry around, take payment by card, have no recurring fees, so no requirement for a steady monthly transaction, and his now ever so valuable Windows XP 0-day, he might end up paying something like 750 US for a 50K, which seems quite cheap for something which is, you know, not going to get patched now. But still, you know, this is not a huge amount of money for the obvious benefits of, you know, not getting mugged on the way back to Thailand. So the first such devices that came out were in the US, such as this. This is the first offering from Square. And it's super simple, you know, it's a little audio thing with props in the top and a mag swipe. You swipe your card, it muxes the data in some crazy sciencey way, sends it over the audio, and the app that can then read it from the audio and verify that data. And these are basically mobile skimming devices. There's no chip and pin, certainly in the US. So you're basically just swiping your credit card into some guy's phone. And the land of the free and home of the brave has never been quite so applicable as to people who are willing to do that. This model has obvious flaws, right? There's so much wrong with this, it's untrue, and we're not even going to look into it anymore other than this was not a bad first attempt, but we obviously need better for the developed world. So continents like Africa and South America, where, you know, we've evolved beyond just swiping our cards into stuff and hoping everything's fine. So we have fairly widespread chip and pin adoption. And chip and pin, if you think about the way that chip and pin works, it works much better to have a standalone terminal. First of all, you need much more than just a mag swipe. You can't just, you know, swipe it. You need to enter a pin number. And if you think about the use case, if you did a similar thing that just kind of plugs into the top, you'd have to hand the mobile device over, then put the card in, put some numbers in, hand it back. So the use case for something that's standalone to the device that you can hand to the person making the payment makes a lot more sense. So that's what we ended up with. So we've got quite a few of these devices here. So there's popular brands such as one from Nedbank, which is a South African bank, Payleven, which is my lovely assistant here, PayPal, so it's quite a big name. This one's actually quite interesting. So PayPal obviously are an online payment provider, and this is, as far as we can tell, their first attempt to make a move into the physical space. So previously, if you're making a PayPal payment, it's going to be basically eBay, something online, whereas now PayPal can push into small businesses, maybe market stalls, that kind of thing. We've got one from WorldPay as well, and Intuit. And finally, the market leader, which at the moment is iZettle. Now, what you'll notice from these devices is a lot of them look quite similar, and there's a good reason for that. So even though they have different plastic, they are essentially underneath the same device, which is the Mura shuttle. They're small embedded Linux to ARM-based device, and they're generic hardware. So once we tore this stuff down a bit, we found out that the hardware that's in here is essentially the same stuff that you might find in some cheap MP3 players, for example. So this is not a specialist bit of kit. It's essentially, Linux with a card slot and a few things tacked on to the side. So if we're looking at these devices from a security perspective, we're really interested in what interfaces are there, how do we interact with this, and then we can start looking at the attack surface. So there's a few obvious interfaces. There's the card slot, so for EMV transactions, for chip and pin. There's the mag swipe at the top, which hopefully we shouldn't be using much with chip and pin, but it's there anyway. There's Bluetooth, so these things work by pairing them with a mobile device over Bluetooth, and that's how you can hand the thing over, and it all happens wirelessly and magic. And then there's micro USB as well, which is mostly used for charging the device. Or at least that's the theory. So the first thing we did, obviously, when we got these is USB. We have lots of USB cables around. We thought we'd plug them in. And straight away, it basically gave up the goods and said, yeah, I'm a mass storage device as well if you need that. So cool, we thought, right, this is going to be a walk in the park. We're just going to, copy all of the pins off there and we'll be done. Obviously, maybe not quite that simple, so we had to take a bit of a closer look at it. Luckily, I think only a couple of them did this wrong, but if we just DD the flash image and run bin walk over it, there were some fairly obvious hints that perhaps they might have just removed it and not zeroed it. So we were able to recover basically the tar gzip, which is used to initialize the device. So this contains all of the device software configuration, not necessarily anything critical. Obviously, there's no data pre-populated here, but it's all of the payment application that runs on the device, the configuration for the EMV, so what it supports, and all the scripts that are used to power up the device, take it down, and handle various events. So we were able basically to start looking at the device, so reverse engineer the binaries and take apart the scripts that it's put together. So we discovered fairly quickly that the images that you can put onto these devices are signed. So the mass storage is there. We can only assume to allow you to do software upgrades as an end user, which is actually a really good feature. If you think about how you might patch traditional POS terminals, there's been a real problem in getting fixes for vulnerabilities discovered onto these devices. Advantage of MPOS is if it's got mass storage and you just drop a signed image from the vendor on there, it should reboot and then reinstall and you're patched. So they've thought about it, certainly, and they've signed the software images. So we didn't find any easy win just to get our own code running by chucking our own modified version of the software on there. However, there's probably only one other thing they could screw up, which is the code that runs to look for software images to install. And yes, while they say, are you a signed image? No. They also support searching through things like tar files. And we managed to find a command injection vulnerability in there, which allowed us to get code execution on the device. So we're going to demo that real quick. Okay, so basically I'll let you all know how this works. You plug in a device, it obviously mounts as mass storage. We're going to run a script which copies this across. This is essentially the code that we're going to run. When you unplug the device, it runs the routine. So it captures the event and runs the routine to search for firmware uploads, and that's basically when the exploit will run. We'll plug it back in, and what we're doing is we're dropping something onto the external mass storage here. Cool. So if we run this, right. So we unplug the device now. Yeah. So this triggers the vulnerability. And so when we plug it back in, the stuff we've dropped should be there. So, yeah. Do you want to type? Yeah. Jollygood.txt, very British file names here. So yeah, you can see we've confirmed that it is indeed a Linux-based system, and the output of ID says we're running as main user ID 500, which is okay. But root would be nice. So luckily, we had access to a lot of the scripts they run internally, and it was fairly quick to find another command injection in something that was running as root. So essentially, we've copied another file across now, which is going to exploit that vulnerability and run the same commands, output to is it a different file or the same file? Different file. Yeah. So you see UID 0 in a different order, just to prove that it's a different script and everything. Yeah, so that was actually a fairly quick and easy way. Obviously, this requires physical access to the device. I don't think anyone making a payment, with a vendor the vendor just wouldn't look the other way if you were sitting there unplugging and plugging and with a laptop, and so it's not the most practical for walking up to a market stall and exploiting it. But if you had access to one of these, I don't know, paid the person who can clean the shop after hours and had access to these terminals, they're fairly easy to get access to because they're not big. You could quite feasibly exploit one of these and just leave the backdoor terminal waiting for the shop owner in the morning, for example. All right, so I'm going to pass over to Nils now to continue with the presentation.
Okay, so at this point we had code execution on the device, and we can now start to assess the device in a more dynamic way. We were able to copy over a GDB server copy, for example, to look at the execution of the main payment terminal application. And as John said, the USB attack vector might not be the most useful for an actionable attacker to look at. So we had to look at the other the remaining attack surface as well. As we mentioned before, they use Bluetooth in order to do the communication with the mobile device. And as we have learned over the years, the mobile device is probably not the most trusted device in the world, especially if you use some Android device in order to take your payments. In those cases, we can probably assume that it is compromised in some way, or that it is feasible, at least for an attacker, to compromise the mobile device. And with a compromised mobile device, they will be able to communicate with the payment terminals which they are paired with as well. So the Bluetooth attack surface is really interesting for an attacker because they could leverage existing access to a device that is paired with the payment terminal in order to get code execution on the payment terminal. Now, one of the features we thought was quite interesting was a file upload feature through the Bluetooth protocol. They use a custom Bluetooth protocol which we reverse engineered in order to communicate ourselves with the payment terminals. And this file upload is usually used to either change the configuration of the payment terminal or to upload updates directly onto the payment terminal in order to update the payment application that is running on these devices. And probably to no one's surprise, in this feature we found another vulnerability which allows us to get code execution on the payment terminal, and we're going to demonstrate that now as well. In the first demo we used the NetBank device. As we said, all of these devices are pretty much based on the same hardware and software with only minor customizations on different devices. The next demonstration we're doing on the PayPal device, probably one of the biggest names in this market. So currently, our laptop is paired with the device, or just pretending that the laptop is the mobile device that is usually driving the payment terminal. And it can connect to the device through Bluetooth. Well, that is if Bluetooth happens to work on Linux for once. So that was successful. We exploited the vulnerability by uploading a custom script. Again, command injection vulnerabilities. It's really like the 90s on these devices. Everything that you find is really straightforward to exploit. What our exploit now did, it opened another serial Bluetooth port to which we should now be able to connect hopefully. So if the exploit works, we will be able to connect to the new serial port that is open on the device. And because it is a little awkward to execute code on the device by rerunning scripts over USB, we now have an interactive shell on the device. We can do everything that we could be doing on a normal Linux system. We even have tab completion working, which is really handy. So you can see the ARM processor that is used in there, 200 megahertz, which is actually not too bad. And through the Bluetooth vulnerability, we got code execution. And again, we exploited the same privilege escalation to go the step up from the main user up to root on the device. And because it is a payment terminal, an attacker could now look at, for example, devices that are available. One example would be the MagSwipe device, and if we now swipe a prepaid credit card through that, was that the right way around?
Yeah. They use this crazy technology. Oh, backtake.
Backtake. Try the other way around.
This one.
Well, it should usually work. For some reason, it doesn't work. Well, maybe the MagSwipe device is not in the right state currently. But anyway, before we were able to read the MagSwipe data straight from the device, and we have full access to all of the other parts of the device as well through this vulnerability. So this attack is already much more useful for an attacker. However, the attacker has to have access to the mobile device that is paired, or needs to be able to somehow pair his own device with a terminal, which might be a problem. To avoid that, there's a much more interesting attack surface as well, and that is a chip and pin smart card interface itself. If we would be able to find a vulnerability in the code that is parsing the chip and pin transaction, we now would be able to exploit vulnerabilities on the device just as a normal customer who makes a payment on the device, which opens up the attack surface by quite a bit. So EMV is a standard being used pretty much everywhere for any card payments. So smart card-based card payments stands for Eurocard, MasterCard, and Visa, which were the organizations working on the standard. So basically, our testing methodology for testing EMV payments is basically a really basic fuzzer which we employed here. We just use any programmable smart card. We initiate the EMV transactions and then return just changed values for any of the steps in the EMV transaction and look for errors on the device. We now have debugging capability, so if we find an error, that makes it really easy to exploit that error as well, or to investigate it further at least. Well, usually a good area to look for bugs in those EMV implementations is the parsing of the different data tags that are transmitted as part of the EMV standard. All of those data tags are stored in the TLV format. We have seen other mistakes in the TLV parsing before. ASNM1 is a good example where they store data in a similar way. So now you're able to not only supply the data itself, but also supply the lengths. And with a lot of the implementations of these chip and pin kernels is what they call the libraries that do the parsing. You often find errors where they expect, for example, an expiry date to be 3 bytes long, and if you supply them with an expiry date that's 200 bytes long, they might run into problems. This EMV kernel, as most of the other EMV kernels we have looked at so far, are usually implemented in C or C++, so they are susceptible to memory corruption if they are not implemented correctly. it didn't take us long to, once we started testing the EMV part of this application, to find a stack-based buffer overflow in the EMV parsing. There's no protection mechanisms on the device which could spoil the fun of exploitation. So there's no NX, no ASLR, nothing that you would expect on a modern device. And actually the bug that we found itself on this device is very similar to a bug that we previously exploited on a different device in 2012. So all of those vendors make similar mistakes in implementing their EMV code. They, for some reason, they trust the EMV input on the smart card to be in a certain format and to be part of their trust model, which is not a great assumption to make. Now, we then had a thought about how do we implement the demonstration, and there's no calc on the device that we could execute, so that's not an option here. And nowadays, exploits really have to be entertaining in order to make for a good demonstration. So we decided to implement a Flappy Bird clone on the device. Just give us a second to set this up. We have a camera here as well so that you can see the actual demonstration. That needs a second for the setup. So this demonstration we are going to do on the device of the market leader, which is iZettle. Again, very similar software to all of the other devices. There are really no big surprises. You now see the device booting up, so it's booting up in a fresh state. We didn't do any persistent changes to the device, so once booted up, it's in the state you will find it at when you buy it off a shop. That takes a brief second. Again, we are not using the iZettle application here to make a transaction. We have implemented our own Python script, Pyment, to do the payment process, which is particularly handy if you do semi-automated testing of the EMV part of the application, so that you don't have to start an actual transaction in the iZettle application. So once this is, so what you see now is the device has booted up, and the screen is really not great for filming the screen. So it says welcome in the middle now, which you probably won't be able to read on the screen. When we now start the Python script, which basically starts a transaction through the Bluetooth protocol, we can see here it's now asking for the card to be inserted. John is going to insert the card. And what we see now is it asks you to enter a PIN. So the first part of the EMV transaction already happened. The second part is started now by entering the PIN. And now it says the PIN is OK. And for some reason, it got stuck there. And the reason it got stuck there is that it has executed the first stage of our payload. At this point, it is listening on again on a Bluetooth serial port. We are able to inject link keys with the code execution as root that we have on the device through the vulnerability. So a device doesn't need to be paired to it to now initialize the second stage on the device, which is our actual payload that is executed. So we can now open another Bluetooth connection, which was opened by the exploit, and we can copy over the second stage, which will then be executed on the device. And we see, well, we potentially would be able to see Chippy pin by MWR Labs, and it asked us to press any key in order to start the game. And I'm really not very good at this, but game over, score 0, almost like the actual Flappy Bird. So if you want to have a play later on, just see us in the bar. We'll bring the card and the terminal. I'm really not good at it. So we wrote the game, but we can't actually play it. it's a fun way of demonstrating that we get code execution on the device, but it also demonstrates a few other interesting factors for actual exploitation on the devices. First of all, we have control of the screen, which is really important because the customer and the merchant will trust a screen of a payment terminal. And we are also able to read the input from the keypad, which would potentially allow us to implement an application that reads the PIN data during a transaction. So there's also some serious points in this demonstration as well. Well, if only I would get to 10. A few more screenshots which are better for readability. You see the game up there as well, and again a score of 0. So an attacker obviously wouldn't implement the game on the device in order to get some benefit out of a vulnerability like this. They would be more interested in how to monetize on these vulnerabilities. So the PIN pad during the PIN entry is in a secure state, but that's only one I/O control away from being switched into the non-secure state so that you can read raw data off of the PIN device. So that's not a problem. We have full control over the screen, so there are plenty of options. But let's look at what an actual payload may look like. An attacker could change the application so that after the PIN entry, it just displays try again, and then switches the PIN pad into the insecure mode and just lock the PIN data. Even better, so EMV actually protects against a lot of the obvious exploitations ways. There's no way of just cloning an EMV card. So just by having the chip card in there doesn't allow you to make a copy of the chip card, which you would then be able to use at ATMs. What it would be more likely is that the attacker then decides to display a fallback message which asks the customer to swipe the card instead of using chip and PIN. We just read the MAC swipe device and then collect the track 2 data. And now we have track 2 data in the PIN for the card, and we can use that to clone a card and use it at ATMs. So we reckon that would be the most likely implementation of an attack. But there are other options as well. The attacker could just implement for a quick win a malicious card which just accepts the payment by getting code execution, changing the application flow to accept the payment without any actual money ever making it to the bank account of the merchant. So that would be a really quick win. What would be a little more interesting attack, especially for banks that would have to investigate those attacks, is to change the terminal into a yes terminal. Some of you might remember the research done by the guys in Cambridge, where they discussed the possibility of a yes card. So basically, to change a card to always say yes to any PIN, and then you can use stolen cards that way for making payments. If you change the terminal to accept every PIN, not even checking the PIN with the card, but just accept the PIN, so you could use a malicious card once to make changes to a terminal, and after that you would be able to use any stolen card, any stolen chip and PIN card on those terminals. And usually banks say that if a transaction is made with a chip and PIN card, that's the customer's fault because someone must have gotten access to the PIN number, so they are often not willing to reimburse them for that. Now, if the terminal is compromised and is changed to a yes terminal, people would be able to make payments on a chip card without having the actual PIN, and that would put the fraud teams in front of quite a few problems. When we found the vulnerabilities at the end of last year, we obviously contacted the vendor about them. Their response was very encouraging. They were very interested in the results. We had a few meetings with them. They are currently addressing those problems. There are online update capabilities for all of those devices, so getting the patches out on those devices shouldn't be a problem. However, no patches have been released as far as we have seen so far, so we're still waiting for that. That's also the reason why we didn't have any full technical details on the vulnerabilities. So the conclusion out of this is, with MPOS basically, as we have seen, it's a fairly promising technology. It's generally a good idea to move the functionality that you need to have secured, like a chip and PIN entry, out of an untrusted device like your mobile phone into a more bespoke device, which hopefully has less code and less attack surface. Maybe it's not a great idea to put a full Linux distribution on there, and maybe you should also consider the software security of any components that you implement on those devices. Most of the flaws that we have seen, you have seen basic stack-based buffer overflows, you have seen command injection. Those are bugs which we thought we have addressed, especially in the desktop and server space. Bugs that have been exploited for more than 20 years, so there's really no excuse for still having those bugs in your systems. And that was pretty much the same situation that we have seen on the traditional payment terminals as well. So these guys have to catch up on software security from the last 20 years in order to address those security vulnerabilities. So future work we plan to look at well, another really interesting attack, especially if you exploit the terminal through the EMV vector, would be then to exploit the mobile device back through the Bluetooth vector, which would give you remote capabilities as well, if you could communicate from the mobile device through the internet and send back any skimmed data and the pins over that channel. So that's something we're still looking at. In a lot of the implementations of the applications, the parsing of the Bluetooth protocol is actually implemented in a native binary, so there's a lot of scope for something to go wrong there. As you have seen, the only attack vector which we didn't find any vulnerabilities in is the MAC swiping itself. The code handling the MAC swipe data is very limited, and even if you find a buffer overflow or something like that in there, you would need a very long card, which might raise some suspicion if you use that in the shop. And obviously, we're planning to implement a few more games on this as well, maybe 2048 or so. Right, any questions?
Wonderful presentation, thank you. So you mentioned that they have a update capability, and you mentioned you didn't do persistence, but would it be easy to do it, persistence?
Yeah, so actually, if you look at the standards, so the PCI standards that apply for those devices, they require that the applications, the payment applications are signed and that you wouldn't be able to change the software. Now, interestingly, that apparently doesn't apply to any libraries or the kernel itself or anything like that. So the application is signed and the signatures are checked on every boot up, but if you just swap out a binary, yeah, that would give you immediate persistence on the device.
Did you use basic cards to deploy the payload?
Yeah, well, in our example, we used basic cards to implement the exploit and also to implement the EMV fuzzing that we used to find the bug, yes.
And without using the secondary Bluetooth upload, how much code could you actually put just on the card? So
the other option we would have had is to just execute the first stage. The really first stage that comes with the data from the stack based buffer overflow can be almost 240 bytes or so. So we get a good amount of ARM code in the first stage. We could then ask the basic card to send over the next stages in chunks of 240 something bytes. So that would be entirely possible. I think the large basic cards have a storage of 60K, and that should really be big enough for any payload that you want to deploy on the device. So that we used the Bluetooth second stage because we are lazy a little bit, but it's entirely possible to have everything on the card, yes.
So you just mentioned you would have to have a long credit card, and which would raise suspicion for, if you want to exploit the actual magnetic field reading. So now it becomes, in the last months, it has been becoming more popular to have like iPhone cases that store your credit card magnetic strip and that play it back by generating a magnetic field. So, once that kind of becomes popular and people are familiar with it, then you could just walk up with your iPhone or whatever device you have and just exploit it. Because essentially then they don't see you swiping, right? You're just...
Yeah,
emulating.
So especially when merchants get used to that form of payment more, then you would be able to exploit a lot more vulnerabilities in the MAC swipe parsing, yes.